what that could have been to say, oh, someone else is brave and speaking out about who they are.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a middle and high school principal and a high school social studies teacher. And as always, I'm joined by
Manuel Rustin, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher. This is my 16th year in the classroom, and this, of course, is All the Above, your home for news and analysis of all things related to education. Jeff, do you notice I sound a little bit different today?
I do. I don't know if you noticed, but at least inside my head, I sound a little bit different today, too. It's been, the plague has come.
It's that time of year.
Yes.
It's that time of year. Kids got me sick, man. Kids got me sick.
Yeah, man. Come back from winter break, and it's like a petri dish.
Man. All right. Going to power through, though.
Yes.
Jeff, what's on today's agenda?
Oh, man. Well, as always, we got a good one. And I'm actually especially more than usual, excited about today's topic. We have two incredible guests coming in, Emily Grijalva and Erin Whalen, who are two fantastic educators here in the Los Angeles area. And they're going to help us unpack, I think, one of the more interesting discussions. You know, we sort of pride ourselves on being a source for conversation about topics in education that don't get discussed. And right. I think that's true. And I think this topic in particular is one that is really not covered enough and not unpacked enough in our kind of mainstream discussion. And that is the ways in which our schools do and do not serve LGBTQ plus students well. So we're going to get into those issues today. Going to think about not only how we're kind of serving the developmental needs of our LGBTQ plus students, but also the visibility of the community in the curriculum and then the kind of lived experience of students on school campuses. So it's going to be a good one today.
I'm looking forward to that. It sounds like it's in keeping with our mission to only invite dope educators.
Oh, we got the dopeness coming. We got
our show.
Double dopeness coming into the studio today.
Nice.
Yes.
Can't complain. All right, but up first is our Do Now, where we'll take a look at recent headlines in education. Stay tuned. All right, now it's time for today's Do Now. Jeff, how are we doing the Do Now today?
Well, man, we're back from vacation and second semester has begun.
Yeah.
And I think just about every corner of the country. And it is time to take attendance. Time to see who's on the new roster, see who's in the house, if
Those
you will.
mid-year roster changes.
I know, man. I know.
All right.
Just one or two changes can upset the whole thing.
Absolutely. All right, so let's see who's first on our roster for today. Jeff, we have Greta.
Greta.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you know which Greta I'm talking about?
I do know which Greta you're talking about. I think she actually pronounces it Greta.
Oh, does she?
I hear her speak.
Well, I like that. I'm not going to try that.
I know, it's like I'm working on my little Swedish accent here.
Dope. All right. How do you say her last name? Thunberg?
Thunberg.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
Nice. All right. So this story is in reference to sort of a response to the increase in climate activism that we've seen across the globe. And New Zealand is stepping to the plate with a change to its curriculum or to what its schools teach in response to some of this activism that we've seen from the likes of Greta and others with regards to our current climate crisis. So according to a story by Charlotte Graham McLay for The Guardian, this year, every school in New Zealand will have access to materials about the climate crisis written by the country's leading science agencies, including tools for students to plan their own activism and to process their feelings of quote-unquote eco-anxiety over global heating. The curriculum will put New Zealand at the forefront of climate change education worldwide. And James Shaw, New England's climate change minister, says, quote, "One of the pieces of feedback we've got from teachers around the country is that they're really crying out for something like this because kids are already in the conversation about climate change." A pilot of this curriculum, which ran in one school in the city of Christchurch in 2018, led to the introduction of materials for the national rollout that helped students process their emotions about the climate issue. Jeff, what do you think about New Zealand rolling out this curriculum in response to global heating?
So I absolutely love it. Probably couldn't love it any more than one could possibly love a policy decision. It's fantastic. And I think, yet again, it is an example of the nation of New Zealand, which, as a wealthier nation in the world, I'm sure has plenty of challenges, right?
Right.
But has shown the ability around gun control and now around, helping to address public consciousness and awareness of the climate crisis, of taking swift, thoughtful, prudent political action and actually getting stuff done, right? So props to the powers that be in New Zealand on this front. I think on the one hand, it's incredibly important from just a literacy standpoint for a nation to be empowering its young people with the knowledge and skills they need to solve the key critical problems of their generation, right? Which, of course, is going to be addressing the effects of climate change. On the other hand, I was actually really surprised that much of the thrust of this policy is about helping students deal with the sort of emotional stress of learning about climate change, which, to be honest, I hadn't been in my head as like the major thing for us to figure out. But I thought it was really interesting and really pushed my thinking about like, okay, so this is really like we're going to study doomsday.
Right.
And, we need to come equipped with helping kids manage the process of fear and anxiety and stress in a world where, for them, just a hop, skip, and a jump over some water is essentially a subcontinent on fire, right?
Right.
So yeah, I love it, and I hope we can learn something from them.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. The idea that it's one thing to teach about the fact that the climate is changing and this crisis is upon us. But what's especially awesome about this curriculum is that it's adding those added elements of, for one, processing the added anxiety and stress that youngsters for sure are feeling. And also there's elements of the curriculum that focus on student activism and what can be done right now about it. So it's not just teaching like, oh, we're doomed, but also here are some things that we can do about it right now so that this isn't just a fatalistic curriculum that just leaves everybody feeling like it's a wrap.
Yeah.
So I definitely love that. The climate change minister, James Shaw, who we mentioned earlier, is quoted in this article in The Guardian saying that being in the conversation itself causes stress, and the students are going to be delving into bad news of science explaining the climate crisis, but the resources have been bolstered with, quote, quite an emphasis on talking through with students how they're feeling about it. That part, talking through with students, I think could be an important element, not just for this curriculum, but a lot of the stuff that students are learning in schools. I know as a U.S. history teacher, learning about slavery and learning about the violence of the past is like, can't just be focused on the negative and the violence of it, but also like, how can we process these feelings and these emotions that we experience in learning about this stuff?
Yeah, we don't want to live in that place of hopelessness with kids, but we do need to confront these sober, realities, right?
Yeah.
So, it sounds really thoughtfully done to me. I'm sure it's not without it, controversy on some level.
Oh,
but,
sure.
I mean, hey, if the United States did this, it'd be a game changer, right?
I'm sure we're probably pretty close to a national curriculum that addresses climate change. Do you not think
communist Obama, Red Scare.
All right. I don't think we're anywhere near that as a nation, but I know definitely states are looking. I mean, California has done quite a bit to address how its curriculum responds to environmental change and what have you. So, but nationally, nah. Shout out to New Zealand and all the activists out there helping make this happen. All right, Jeff, who else do we have in the house today?
All right. Next up, Manuel, is special education teachers.
Oh, that's a lot of them, Jeff, and I'm sure they are all fully supported in their roles and that everything is going fine with that regard. So
there's great. Almost nothing that you just said that is true at all. There's not nearly enough of them. They're not particularly well supported, and their jobs are so stressful that many of them are leaving. So let's get into this. So We're discussing today an article by Diana Lambert that appeared in EdSource, who's reporting particularly on California, although the same can be said of many states around the country, that, of course, there's a statewide teacher shortage we're grappling with. But in the midst of that, many of California's 800,000 special education students are being taught by teachers who haven't completed their teacher preparation program yet, or who have received only partial training, right? So according to the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, about 60% of first-year special ed teachers were working without a full SPED teaching credential. This is the highest number that we've seen on that front in a decade, and there are all kinds of ripple effects from this, right? People who are less prepared for the job tend to stay in the job for shorter periods of time and increase turnover. So there's a compounding effect. Folks who are perhaps less trained and prepared for the job can be less effective in meeting the needs of students. And in the field of special education, we're talking about students who have, documented particular special needs that should require special training. Right. So we're in this situation, particularly in the domain of special ed, where need is greatest and the teaching skill, experience, resources certainly are not matching the need right now. So, Manuel, what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's troubling. It's not a surprise. I think anybody who works with schools knows that special ed teachers are some of the highest need teachers with regards to actually filling those spots and supporting them. Some of my favorite teachers are special ed teachers who have told me that they wish they could really focus on teaching the curriculum. However, they're so underwater with so much paperwork, so many IEP meetings, and such a lack of support that it's like the teaching the curriculum becomes secondary. And when you're doing that to a teacher, it's no surprise that they're not going to stick around for long. And then if teachers aren't sticking around for long, then there are going to be vacancies. And if there's vacancies, there's going to be a push to try to fill those vacancies. And now you have people coming in to fill the vacancies who haven't even finished their credentialing programs yet. So we pulled this from an article in EdSource by Diana Lambert. She quotes California State Board of Education President Linda Darling Hammond, one of the GOATs, I should say, one of the GOATs in education research.
Yeah.
Who pointed out that underprepared teachers are much more likely to resort to suspensions and other things to just try to survive. And that's not good for the teacher or the school, and most especially for the student. And it's really troubling that, when we talk about supporting teachers, when we talk about teacher compensation, and we talk about all the, teacher strikes that across the nation, 2 years ago now, or a year ago actually for Los Angeles Unified School District. Sometimes we talk about teachers as like a monolithic group, like all teachers need more compensation, more of this, more of that, and that is true. However, there are segments of teachers that are in a special amount of need for support, and special ed teachers are one of those groups that it's like there's, on one hand, it's the national conversation about supporting teachers and having fair compensation, but then there's the more specific conversation about special education teachers and their workload and the amount of burden that's placed upon them without the support from their schools or from their districts. And that to me is like sort of a piece of the conversation that needs to not be just forgotten or overlooked in the national conversation about supporting teachers. This is sad, man, because I know the special teachers that I know, they chose special education because they had a truly individual, unique, personal connection to supporting those students, and they get into it with all these high hopes, and then it's just like a tidal wave of expectations and work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everything you said there certainly makes a lot of sense and resonates, I think, with much of what I have seen and experienced in my career as well. I'll just add that I think that we probably need to have a larger conversation, a seminar discussion around this topic of special ed. And certainly the teacher shortage issues are part of that equation, but also there's just a massive bureaucratic weight upon the entire field of special education that is both really important because we live in a country with a pretty dark history around isolating, segregating, ostracizing students with disabilities,
Right.
that we have worked hard to try to get out of,
Right.
so that students can have access to school and to the curriculum, right, and to the social experience of being among their peers. At the same time as we've created this monster that is so onerous in some ways on special ed teachers, on administrators, counselors in schools, particularly schools that serve high concentrations of students with special needs, where the resources really are not brought to bear to meet the need. Right. And so I think there's a lot more to be discussed there. I will say, I guess in closing, there is some good news here. The state of California is, and particularly under our new governor, Gavin Newsom's administration, is trying to take some steps to address this. So, their districts are thinking about paying bonuses for special ed teachers or doing extra things to recruit them. And the state is also investing $90 million to cover tuition fellowships for aspiring teachers who commit to teach subjects with chronic shortages, including kind of first and foremost special education. So, there's some efforts being put into place here to try to address this, but certainly a long way to go on this front.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. Maybe somebody in our audience could fill me in on this. I've only worked in schools where the special ed single subject teacher is doing the single subject teaching and also covering IEPs and the meetings and all that stuff. To me, it would make sense if there were a teacher to focus on teaching math, let's say, or history or whatever, and then a separate individual who's responsible for like the legwork of all the paperwork, all the bureaucracy that you mentioned. To me, that makes sense instead of it falling on one person to do the teaching and the bureaucratic pieces of it. But I don't know if there's schools out there that do it that way. I know that would cost a lot because now you're talking two individuals for, I guess, theoretically one spot. But to me, that would make sense, at least at the secondary level.
Yeah, so I mean, how schools, districts, states approach this does vary some, and even by level, it can be very different. So at the elementary level here in Los Angeles, at least, there tends to be a little more of a position from the district that might work across a couple of schools that focuses almost entirely on kind of carrying out the IEP process.
Right.
But the components of the IEP kind of require different types of expertise. So if we were to completely separate the sort of administrative function of carrying out the IEP from the like diagnostic goal setting functions within the IEP that really requires someone who like knows the kid and watches them every day, I think we might get get some unintended outcomes from removing them from the process. Not to say there aren't some like efficiencies and things that could be done better, but yeah, this is part of what I think it would be interesting to unpack, right? It's like, yes, we want to attend to the needs. Yes, there's all these things that like we want to do and should do. Do we have the right resources and systems in place to actually carry them out in a day and age where the special education population is expanding pretty significantly? So, lot to unpack there.
All right. Sounds like an upcoming seminar. All right, Jeff, one last name on our roll sheet for today.
All right. Who we got?
Check it out. Who we got? Fairfax County Public Schools.
Okay. Like Fairfax, Virginia?
Yes, indeed.
Northern Virginia? Okay.
Yes, indeed. Some of our listeners would say that our program here is very California focused, and it might be. We are based in California, and California also is at the forefront of a lot of the great things that are happening. But
is also at the back front of a lot of the bad things that
we don't
are
need to talk about that, Jeff.
I don't know if that's
we don't
a term,
need to talk about that part, Jeff.
Yeah.
But of course, we are interested in stories across the nation, and Fairfax County Public Schools appears to be perhaps at the forefront of this idea regarding student activism and student protests. So one of the largest school districts in the county, which is Fairfax School District, which is in Northern Virginia, has about 189,000 students, recently announced a policy to allow students to have one excused absence for taking part in quote-unquote civic engagement, which could include marches, protests, things of that nature. So if you'll recall, Jeff, recently, what was it, last semester in the fall, there was sort of a worldwide march amongst youth for climate change. And of course, prior to that, we had March for Our Lives and a lot of national and international protests around certain issues. And students, of course, are missing school for that. So Fairfax County Public Schools wants to both encourage students to take part in civic engagement activities, but also do it in a structured way, I suppose, with regards to their attendance. So they are allowing one excused absence for participation in this. This isn't going to be controversial at all, right, Jeff?
Not even slightly. I'm sure all of the, in particular, conservative folks who have such great trust in the institution of public education being fair and balanced are just going to sit on their couch and not troll online about this at all.
That's nice. That's a relief, actually.
Yes, I know. Next subject.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, so obviously there's conservative critics of this plan, and there's also critics, I guess you could say, quote unquote, on both sides. Conservative critics saying that this is basically schools enabling left-wing radical politics, since a lot of the marches and protests that have garnered attention over the last several years have been more on the left side of politics with regards to gun violence and climate change. Then there are other folks who say this is like, trying to systematize protest, which by nature is against the system. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this, Jeff?
Yeah, so I actually really appreciate it as a policy, but I think almost by definition, what is happening here is not like a revolutionary act, right? So in order to create and stoke the fires of social change, there is some component of protest, of disruption, that needs to be at play, right? If the system is like, sure, do that thing, then like we don't really have a problem, right? So I think it's a thoughtful, responsible policy, understanding that we are living in a time of great, urgent, broad social needs: gun control, climate change, poverty and wealth inequality, the impeachment of the president, the very functioning of what remains of our democracy, right? Like these are deep existential questions for which every person who has a stake in our society should care a lot, right? And so to be in a position where you're responsible for the education of young people and you are putting in structures that limit their participation in these spaces, I think is not a good thing, right? And so I think this is just a recognition that there's valuable learning to be done by students by experiencing stuff in the real world. Not altogether, frankly, different than policies that make it safe for students to go on field trips, right? Like I think to me, this falls in just the same kind of, from a policy perspective, the same kind of experience. Now, the reality is, I think, as you said, most of the social movements that are doing the kinds of things that are drawing lots of attention right now, that where students would take advantage of this policy are more progressive causes at the moment. Although there are things like the so-called March for Life, I think that just recently took place or is about to take place in Washington, D.C. You have, the alt-right folks and white nationalist folks, and ostensibly a student could participate in those kinds of things. In the state of Virginia, not long ago, we had a whole bunch of armed militia folk who descended upon the Capitol there with the governor declaring a state of emergency, and one of the the students could have picked up an AR-15 and gone to the rally, right? True. So there's the makers of this policy said, and I quote, this is from Fairfax School Board member Ryan McElveen, said that the policy move wasn't meant to be political, and that, quote, we wrote the language so that it would be completely neutral and that students from all walks of life could participate, right? So, I think there is some neutrality in here. It's probably going to mean kids do more progressive kinds of stuff than conservative kinds of stuff, because that's just the nature of how protest functions in our society, and we have fascist Republicans in charge of stuff, so they're not protesting. They're happy with what's going on.
There you go.
Facts. That's facts.
So, to be clear, the policy itself, the way it's written up, right now, a student would have to notify the school 2 days ahead of time, submit a form, which is describing their civic engagement that they'll be participating in. And they are supposed to report to school at least once during that day, like I guess some kind of check-in or something. And administrators at the school don't have the power to veto the proposal of what the student's going to do. However, if there is anything that they find concerning, this policy is written up to send that to the regional superintendent, who will then take some kind of action, although that's not quite clear either. And I don't know what happens if a student goes through this and they take part in something for that day, and then later on that school year, something spontaneous happens because of unforeseen events, and a student, participates in that. So does this make it an extra tough penalty to participate if you didn't submit the form? Or, I don't know, I'm just kind of curious what happens after that 1 day is up. But, sounds like a policy that is well-intended, like many, but to have to, as a social science teacher, I'm just picturing myself, teaching students to, when you want to go out and fight for change, you fill out this form, you bring it to the school administrator 2 days ahead of time, and while you're fighting for change, make sure you check in the school that day. Otherwise, there could be consequences. Like, that just sounds ridiculous. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I hear you. On the other hand, right, like if you want to, when Martin Luther King was getting ready to march, like they did go oftentimes and like file for permits.
That part is true. Yeah.
Right. So there is. I totally understand the the tension that you're raising, but I don't think it's like inherently bad. I think that's where I was going with up front about like, this does not mean like Fairfax County schools are like now revolutionary, right? This just means I think they're making space for students to engage in really powerful learning experiences outside of school.
Yeah.
So good for them.
All right, folks, that about does it for today's Do Now. And interesting headlines there, and definitely regarding that special ed discussion, we would love to hear from some audience members regarding what the context is at your particular school or school site regarding special education and how that workload is, distributed. But for now, we are heading towards our seminar where we'll discuss LGBTQ plus youth in our schools and how schools could be supportive of their development and inclusive of those themes and issues in the curriculum. Stay tuned.
All right, folks, welcome to today's seminar. I am super excited, as I mentioned earlier, that we have two incredible guests with us who are going to help us unpack this really rich topic around how our schools do and do not serve the needs of our LGBTQ students. So furthest from my right is Erin Whalen. Welcome, Erin. Erin is the founding assistant principal at Da Vinci Rise High School here in the Los Angeles area. It is a multi-campus school serving students in South LA and in Hawthorne, who have experienced foster care, housing instability, probation, and other circumstances that have disrupted their journey in school. Rise was the recipient of the coveted $10 million startup grant from the XQ Super School Project, which funds educators creating innovative new high schools. Erin has been a teacher in Miami and Los Angeles, a TFA core member advisor in Los Angeles and Phoenix. He likes the hot places, apparently, and was a posse scholar at Grinnell, which is in a less hot place. Erin is from a proud Black, Chicano, and indigenous family here in LA and was born and raised in the city. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you.
And to my immediate right, we have Emily Grijalva. Emily is the Restorative Justice Coordinator and sponsor of the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or GSA, at Felicitas and Gonzalo Mendez High School in Boyle Heights. She taught English for 12 years, where her pedagogy was rooted in social justice and in love, which is just fantastic. We'll have to talk more about what that means. And Emily received the United Way's Inspirational Teacher Award in 2014. She was recognized in 2016 by the Obama administration's White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, and won the Partnership for LA Schools Courageous Teacher Award in 2017. 2017. She is a UCLA Writing Project Fellow, where she also earned her master's degree. She's a mom. Atlanta is here in the studio with us, so shout out to Atlanta for coming in today. And she is the proud youngest daughter of Central American immigrants. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for joining us here on All the Above, and really excited to dig into today's conversation with you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both for joining. Emily, I believe you're the second UCLA Writing Project guest we've had, or affiliated guest in the last couple episodes, because Ming Jung Pei was a UCLA Writing Project Fellow as well.
They actually just sent out the invitational, so I really encourage. It's an amazing professional development. And it really makes you see yourself as a writer and really think about the writing strategies that you're bringing into your classroom. So I highly recommend it.
All right.
Dope.
LA educators.
Yes.
Be on the lookout. Yes.
UCLA Writing Project in the house. So Erin, let's start with you. Undoubtedly, schools or our profession has not served LGBTQ plus youth well at all historically throughout our school system. What changes do you see schools doing now, and what impact, if any, do you see happening?
Yeah, I think it's become a larger part of the conversation when thinking about, in 2011, California really spearheaded the conversation of incorporating LGBTQ history and the growth of kind of justice in that community into the curriculum. But I would say that there's a lot of work to be done around what that looks like to implement. And so I think you can identify, hundreds of LGBTQ people in history and teach about it, but are you speaking about the LGBTQ part of that history and of that experience? I also think that there is a lot of work to be done around creating strong and brave spaces for staff members, because if staff members don't feel safe showing their identity, then how can they be strong models for youth? I think a lot of the times we do work in the way that is easiest, which is to teach a story, teach a tale, versus what does it mean to make a safe space for staff members so that they can therefore model that for the youth in the building.
Yeah, Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question also, and especially as being someone who is intimately involved in creating at least one of those types of safer spaces on campus as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a really proud sponsor of our GSA. I love my students. They're amazing, and they've done a lot of work to challenge the way that schools create those spaces for students. And a few years back, we were really active in the LGBTQ resolution that passed in LAUSD, which included asking for more inclusivity in curriculum, especially in history, including students in history textbook adoption process to make sure that they are inclusive, having gender neutral restrooms, celebrating October as LGBTQ History Month, and also more training for staff members. And so while it completely passed and we have it in paper, I'm currently part of the task force because even though that it did pass, not all schools are really owning the work, and I think that's where we're stuck right now. Like, how do we ensure that it is being carried out? Because even as much as I love the work that we've done at Mendes, like, we still have to do a lot of that work, and so that's kind of where we're at right now. We're like, how do we ensure LAUSD, such a large district, is actually following through with the resolution?
Yeah. So I think I'd love to probe a little bit more on we've taken a lot of important steps, but it does still feel like there's a lot of work to still be done. And Emily, when you mentioned the gender neutral restrooms, I had a bit of a flashback because another school, which I know you have done some work with or know in LA, Santee High School, I think had the district's first gender neutral restroom. And I was actually called to that campus. This was a couple of years ago now, shortly after they opened the gender neutral restroom, because just a really vitriolic hate group, essentially, that carries itself as a church, showed up at the school with loudspeakers right around dismissal, and just spewing the worst things you could say. I mean, literally like pointing at kids and being like, you're a fornicator and your mom is going to hell. I mean, terrible things, right? Which, of course, you know, you come to the hood and you start talking to kids you don't know that way, also threatens to like start a riot, right? And so, you know, that was both, it was just strange, like, wow, we've taken this step forward. And as soon as we do, there's this horrible response, right? And so, anyways, you made me think so much of the like this combination of like, wow, great, we're doing some things, and
then there's
oh my
backlash.
God, we have so much work left to do.
GSA definitely learned from Santi a lot. I mean, they were so brave, and the students handled that situation amazingly, and I think it really helped that most of the staff were, you know, supportive. And so when Mendes, a year later, fought for our multiple stall gender neutral restroom, we really thought about, well, there needs to be some education done beforehand. So the students, you know, created surveys. They actually presented to every single class themselves, like about what does gender neutral even mean, first of all, why it's important. And so a lot of the students were on board at that point, and then they also went out to the staff. And I think the hard part was there were actually some staff members that were not in favor of having a gender neutral restroom. And, you know, as an educator, we want to protect our students. And they were a little like, wait, what? Like some of our own teachers don't even think we should have this. And so we had to have, you know, really courageous conversations around that. But for the most part, the majority of staff and the administration were completely on board. So we decided to kind of slow down the process and kind of like spend time surveying, like educating, doing presentations before we actually then opened the gender neutral restroom. But yeah, definitely Santi like paved the way for that. As far as other schools now, most schools have a gender neutral restroom, but accessibility and visibility is an issue. So I've heard from other students in other schools saying that they have to look for an administrator to open this like random, you know, bathroom that's hidden. And so again, some work's been done, but not all schools have a very accessible gender neutral restroom.
Yeah.
I think a huge challenge too is we want our schools to be emblematic of a world that doesn't yet exist. Right, we want it to be a place where our youth can be safe and they can feel comfortable when we know, in fact, for many of them, walking out of the doors of our schools, there's a different reality that they have to face. And so I think something that Emily spoke to beautifully was like, how do we prepare them adequately for walking out into the world in their truth, and while also showing them that there is a possibility for a community that can be more accepting and loving. And it's like that balance, right, of how we do those things at the same time. And I think that's a huge challenge in education, because at times we want to be on the forefront of changing those realities, but it takes a world to do. And so we have to kind of do both.
Yeah, and I remind our youth that they're like way ahead of us. Like the adults are barely catching up, even with like the vocabulary, new identities. You know, and I'm really proud that a lot of our youth are coming up with more ideas of gender fluidity, right? Like being more gender fluid, being more open, and the adults are barely starting to catch up. So sometimes, you know, we have to talk about those frustrating moments about why the adults aren't where they are ready to be.
Now, and I think you've both spent most of your career serving marginalized communities. And I teach at a school that's almost entirely Black and Latinx population. And a few years ago, we had, I think we were the first school in the area to have a transgender prom queen. And teaching in a marginalized context and supporting LGBTQ youth comes with its own sort of intersectional challenges. And in my memories of our prom queen being selected and just seeing, you know, sort of the transphobia and the homophobia that comes within the Black community and within the Latinx community. I was wondering if you could speak to that, the challenge of supporting LGBTQ plus youth in addition to serving in a marginalized context and sort of those intersections that are there.
It's a huge question. Yeah, go ahead.
We only ask the huge questions here.
So I work in Boyle Heights, so it is predominantly Latinx. Definitely most of our families are immigrant, majority Mexican descent, but we do have Central American. Many of our families are religious, can be conservative. And so, yes, that's something that I have to be very mindful. And so we have these conversations, especially with my GSA, where they don't tell their parents they're in GSA, right? Like they're just not there yet. They don't feel safe coming out. They're at a chess club. They're getting tutoring. Like there's, whatever. And that's fine. Like they don't have to, the whole coming out process is a very vulnerable and sacred one. And so when they're ready, and they feel that they have the safety, they can, but that's something that I have to constantly navigate. But a lot of our families are accepting, and that's also amazing. But a lot of it is them needing resources. So I've worked with some Latina moms whose children are transitioning, and they just don't know like what the process is. So making sure that we have access to those resources. What does it mean to have their child's chosen name and gender pronouns respected? And it's something that I've had to learn to navigate too within the school system to support them. So it's like I've seen a mixture of both. I've seen parents be super like supportive, but then also some cases where students are just going to wait for college, or like, when they feel a little bit better. I also appreciate that in Boa Heights, we do have, organizations like the Latino Equality Alliance who are trying to do more like public campaigns, provide support groups for parents. They've come and done education series for our parent center. So I think that there's definitely, growth, but it is something that we have to be consistently mindful for our student safety.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of cocooning that happens in the school where a student does feel comfortable enough to share those pieces of their identity or discover through it with you. But they know that it's not necessarily
What does that mean, cocooning?
Cocooning, where they've found a safer, brave space where they can develop and grow and learn and explore their identities and how they're processing through it all. Where in fact, when they go home, right, that's where they morph. They have to code switch and change into what is expected of them. I think just in thinking about the intersectionalities between identity and LGBTQ youth and foster care, right? LA has one of the largest, if not the largest, population of foster youth in the country. Many of those are LGBTQ youth, right, from being kicked out on the streets after coming out. And so it's a reality that our youth are aware of. It's something that they've seen happen before. And so even if their families may be more accepting than they even realize, it's a narrative that they've seen play out with friends, with family members. And so that becomes a overarching kind of deterrent from becoming who they are or showing who they are in the public eye. I think LA LGBT Center has an incredible job providing beds and housing for youth in that situation. But LA also has very, very few beds. And so it can be really, really challenging. So I think about the resources necessary to allow for a community where students can take that risk and kind of, come out in that way.
Yeah. So I'm actually wondering if you can maybe go a little bit deeper on that, Erin, because your school, Rise High School, was founded to serve specifically that type of population, right? Like, correct me if you think this is an unfair description, but I kind of think of it as like within the marginalized students of LA, you're serving the marginalized students who have been marginalized from that system, right? So like sort of multiple layers of marginalization, and yet students who are trying to make it work in school. And for me to think about being a student who's struggling, with housing or struggling with, the challenges that come with being in the foster system, and with navigating my identity, in terms of sexuality or gender identity, and figuring out how to like go to English and get my credits, right? It's just, there's a lot going on there. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the uniqueness of that population and some of the things your school does to create the cocoons or those sorts of things to help students find a way.
Yeah, I mean, I would say firstly, like self-discovery is often stunted when you're thinking about your basic needs, right? And so when thinking about like Maslow's hierarchy, when you're thinking about survival, your self-discovery, your ability to discover self and to express is often really, really stunted because you're a baby trying to survive in a world without resources. And so I think for a lot of our incredible youth, they've started to learn how to transcend that, where they've started to think about how can we discover ourselves? How can we understand who we are in this world while also finding resources along the way, which it blows me away. It like keeps me in this work is to see kids do that, because I don't know if I could have done that growing up at that age. And so I think that is a huge process in that we want to take away all of those boundaries that stop our kids from discovering themselves, right? So let's take care of food, let's take care of your ride, let's take care of safety, so that we can start having conversations about who you are. We can start looking into how you're feeling and how you're processing. And I think that unfortunately that's some of the most frustrating parts about being an educator, is that you want to take away all those boundaries from your kids, but our job is to educate the student. But often we wear the hat of a nurse, we wear the hat of a counselor, we wear the hat of a social worker. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the school exists, is because we realize that youth in foster care, youth on probation, youth on the streets in homeless shelters weren't able to reach that level of self-discovery because they're out there fighting in the world. And so that's inequitable, because then they become 18, all of their resources stop, and then the world is asking them who they are, how can they help support the world that never supported them, but we didn't give them any baseline of resources or support along the way. And so I think obviously that's all youth, right, in those situations. But when you think about LGBTQ youth, they become 18, they go out into the world, and then they've had none of the incredible resources that Emily's a part of providing for them, right? Any of those identity work and self-empowerment, but then the world is asking them these questions while also not providing any means or resources for how to make that healthy. And so I think that at Rise, we're consistently trying to say, how do we take those blockages away from you so that you can just be a student? I think it's a privilege, and we forget sometimes to just be a student. And like my mom used to say, your job is to be a student. I didn't realize until working in education for so long that that's a huge privilege for me to be like, I don't have to worry about anything else but being a student. Is something that is not given to everyone. And so we try to get our kids as close to that, so that then they can say, well, okay, well, now in all of this, who am I? And what are parts of my identity that I still need to discover and express?
Yeah. So recently, an LGBTQ activist from the UK, at least that's how his Twitter account identifies himself, Alexander Leon, had a tweet that went viral. And there was a quote there that I thought was pretty provocative, and would love to read it and get your take on like the ways in which this experience plays out for students in our city and in your schools, and what schools can do to interrupt this kind of experience. So he said that queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we've created to protect us. So, that really, I was just thumbing through Twitter and saw it and was like, ooh, that's deep. We need to talk about that when we have Emily and Erin on. But would love to hear your thoughts about how that plays out in school.
Yeah, I thought that it was a very heartbreaking quote, and I read it. And I think that as an educator, we're committed to making sure our students feel seen, heard, loved, supported. And, and I think you kind of spoke to that sometimes the outside world is not a very safe space. So if they're, having to wear a mask and perform, and then they walk into the school, like our hope is that they can, let some of the guard down and be themselves. And if they don't feel that, then we're doing a disservice, right? And I think of that being extremely traumatic. Like, I don't, as a cisgendered woman, right, like I have that privilege where I don't know what it's like to, face abuse, humiliation, violence, because I am not, subscribing to a box. I'm not subscribing to a binary. And so I think that just reminded me of how important it is starting from elementary that we have inclusive curriculum, that we have where students can see themselves and know that, that they matter and that they've been here forever and, and they can move on to great things. But if they're just constantly hiding themselves, I mean, we can look at all the research about LGBTQ students, who have like high rates of absenteeism, academic failure, right? Sometimes dropping out, just not wanting to be in school because it is not a safe space. And so I think that quote shows that this is what then they become those adults who are trying to figure themselves out because school just wasn't that space of discovery. It wasn't that space of support. And so that is us failing as educators.
Yeah, that quote made me think about the manifestations of that silencing. We often see chronic absenteeism, huge in LGBTQ youth. We see violence and aggression and fighting, or the almost opposite, which is like the withdrawal, where it's like the mute almost, not to speak because my identity is something that's not appreciated. And so I think about, we often see the manifestations and then school is told to punish those manifestations, while not addressing and turning a mirror to what community are we creating and what might that be a manifestation of. And so I think about how we can look at our discipline systems, how we can look at our counseling and the numbers of counselors. Most schools have one counselor to 800 kids. And so how do we create a system to support that? It also made me think about, again, going back to staff trainings and staff development. Again, if you're a person, an LGBTQ person, I know the first 2 years I was in the classroom, I didn't tell any kids that I was gay ever. And it was something that I knew that I could be fired. It was something that was told to me before, that to not do that, to not share that. And then I think about the youth that I served in my classroom and what that could have meant to them, what that could have been to say, oh, someone else is brave and speaking out about who they are, or just having a picture of me and my partner on the desk, right? Things that cisgender or heteronormative folks do and don't think twice. We are often, even as adults, even working with kids, even doing identity work, we hide those things. And so I think I often have to reflect on myself now in the leadership position of being, assistant principal. What are things that I'm not, that I might be doing if it were more normative in the world? What are things that even now I'm still not thinking about? What is my background on my phone? Do I care if it's face up when my students see it and it's me and my partner? Is it, do I care about the background of my computer? Do I care about when we're talking about family structures, what mine looks like versus what, the other teachers might look like? And so I think that our own identity work and self-work and being visible and being proud can do a lot more than we often give credit for. But that starts at the top. That starts at folks who are hiring, and then that starts and so if we don't do it up here, we can't keep looking down at our students, down figuratively. We can't keep looking to our kids really up and expecting them to do this work and to be comfortable and to create the environment amongst each other if we're not modeling the exact same thing, because they're watching all the time. And so I think we have to consistently think about that.
Right. Well, let's talk about the sort of on high in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of our education system as a whole. There's been some progress recently with regards to inclusive curriculum, at least in certain states like California, in terms of certain legislation to protect LGBTQ youth. But on a systemic level, what more do you think needs to happen in order to advance the cause for all of our youth?
So definitely the policy is there, right? We have the Fair Education Act, right, where we're supposed to be showing the contributions socially, politically, economically that LGBTQ folks have done. We have the California Healthy Youth Act, where our sex ed should be comprehensive, inclusive, and include discussion and workshops around gender identity and sexual orientation. And I mentioned the LGBTQ resolution through LUSD. So we do have the framework, we do have the resources. There's so much, just different workshops and curriculum that's out there. But like I mentioned, I just it's in paper, but I'm starting to get a little frustrated and impatient at that it's not being fully carried out. And I think I agree that it kind of needs to start from the top too. I feel that a lot of administrators need to own the work and they need to get educated and aware of why this is so important so that they're making sure that it is a priority in their schools. Also teachers, support staff. I've had awkward situation even with our school police, not understanding why we have a gender neutral restroom. And I'm like, wait, what? It's the law, lady. So I think a lot of times it's people aren't yes, there's policy in place and it's supposed to be happening, but it's not. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think, all those policies lay out an amazing framework, amazing ideas. It's there, but it's just the rolling out. If the administrators and educators aren't owning the work, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
I think it has to be a component of training and professional development for all staff in a school.
Yeah.
And I think about what burden are we placing on our youth if they're discovering their own identities, they're discovering the terminology and the words for it, but then they have to continuously educate the adults. And so I think if we're not following suit in saying, okay, we are going to also discover and understand these facets of not only our own identities, but the identities in the building, then we're just doing a disservice. We're, again, pointing to the kids and saying, you guys do the work, and we're going to watch, and we're going to pick up pieces that we feel comfortable with, and then we'll incorporate as needed. And that's not fair. That's not going to ever be a system that is just or right for kids. So I think, the legislation is there, the framework is there. Just like desegregation, like the framework is there, but in practice, like how do we actually slowly process through this and do the work that's uncomfortable? I think often when we see education, we've always felt, there's a lot of systems that we're placed against that are unfair, and so sometimes things like this can feel unfair for educators, right? Oh, another thing that I'm having to learn about and discover and worry about, or this goes against my personal morals and values. And I think it's like, okay, well, let's have a conversation around maybe like who should be educating youth, and then what does that mean? I think we need a systematic change there first, which is more uncomfortable.
So I'd love to just follow up a little bit on what you were just sharing about this idea that, we have things on paper that tell us what the new normal should be, and yet behavior, decision-making, practices are not always in line with that. And I wonder if you can give an example or two of that would maybe help our audience understand, what would it look like to act differently in accordance with what we are saying on paper is how we need to behave now in a way that is better and healthier for our LGBTQ youth.
So for sure, ways that at my high school that we've been trying to push some of these policies in place. So one, having a gender neutral restroom, multiple stall in a visible, easily accessible place. That was really, like I said, we had our principal support. So that was major. I think another area has been around professional development. So when I was a teacher, I spent, basically those 12 years never, ever receiving some kind of professional development around how to best support LGBTQ youth. I was never encouraged to seek it out on my own. And so I kind of had to do that. And it can be kind of lonely, but, I went out of my way to try to educate myself. And so, I brought it up to local school leadership. I was like, we need to include professional development. And so we were able to, we invited Latino Equality Alliance. They did a workshop to our staff, and it was the first PD of the year. So that was also major, that we were setting the tone, that this was an important topic. And so they addressed homophobia. We talked about how we can address homophobic language in the classroom, how we can support our youth. And then there was another time where GSA took over the English and history PD, and they brought in resources from one archive and other resources. They talked about why it was important to them, and we were able to give teachers, what do teachers always say they need? Time and resources. So they were given that to lesson plan, and the students kind of sat with the teachers to bounce off ideas. And so that was really impactful because the students were also involved in that change. So those are a few instances where we've tried to kind of push forward. Also our sex education, making sure that it is comprehensive. I literally had to stand up and say, we're breaking the law, the California Healthy Youth Act. We need to be comprehensive. And so luckily local school leadership agreed. And so those are a few times where we've had to really push. But it's usually just a few people doing the work.
Yeah, I think we always want to be preventative and create spaces where youth can share. So thinking about community circles within advisories or within spaces where they're talking about issues facing marginalized communities. I think that's obviously one piece. But I would say to some of the more restorative or reactive pieces, I think my favorite question that happens in a school is, whose job is it? Right. And so I think I've been in schools where there will be a hate crime or there will be slander on the walls around LGBTQ identities, and it's always the question, is the principal looking at us, whose job is it? The teachers looking at each other, whose job is it? And then usually it falls on the GSA, which is again not fair.
It's me.
Again not fair.
It's Emily's job. We had this conversation. She'll take care of it.
So I think that was when I went into leadership and became an assistant principal. That was the biggest thing I wanted to change. Is we had an incident where there was some slander on one of the walls addressing a teacher who out and identifies as LGBTQ, and so in that moment, I think we had an opportunity to say that's when we're going to do something different. Myself and the principal, we said it's our job. This is like, we need to own this. And not only that, but you can't put it on the shoulders of other people, especially youth who are in that identity group and feel those. It could be emotionally taxing to take on the job of now educating others and then standing up for those who are hurt. And so what we did is we ultimately had community circles with every single advisory in the school to talk about what was said, why it's not okay, and then kind of get insight from students around what they were feeling, what they were thinking, what their agreement was. Not to say what's right or wrong, but to have a conversation about, from us, like having that conversation facilitated by us, really coming from kids, around how our school can be a place that is safe and brave, and why that's a representation of that not being safe and brave. And so I think if we're not willing to jump to the classroom as administrators, if we're not willing to have conversations with families and to get in uncomfortable situations, then it will always fall on GSA. It will always fall on the community that it actually should not be. I think when there is a hate crime or when there is an incident that is really painful for an identity group, it should not automatically be looked at them to solve it, because often it's an issue with all of the other people and other identity groups. And so I think until we get that mentality and we look at that in leadership, that will continue to be a problem, and legislation is not going to cut it if we don't think of it in that lens.
Yeah. So last question, and I think in some ways builds on what you were just sharing, Erin, which is, what do educators and the adults working in our schools need to know or do in order for us to have the schools that our LGBTQ youth deserve?
I mean, I think representation matters, right? Making sure that your curriculum and instruction is inclusive. I'll shout out another professional development. The UCLA History Geography Project collaborates with One Archive, and every summer they actually pay the teachers a stipend to come and do lesson plans around for U.S. history teachers specifically, but it's open to other subjects as well. And you get to be in the One Archive space, and that has the largest database of LGBTQ materials. And you get to create lessons, and you get paid for it, and then you share these lessons, and they post them. So I feel like, accessing those workshops that are there, reaching out and doing your own education, because it shouldn't be the students, And even myself, like I remember the first time a student wrote in her essay that she was pansexual, and I hadn't heard that word yet. So I had to go and educate myself around like what are some of the new terms that are coming up, and so I think that teachers should be constantly making sure that they're aware of the changes and trends, and really do the work. And also, if we have administrative support, that's key. But I really hope that more and more educators realize that this is part of our job in serving our students.
Absolutely. I would agree. I would say consistently do the identity work necessary to transgress what you grew up knowing. I think until we really consider the education field and professionalize it like we would the medical field or we would law, we need to consistently grow and learn and develop. And if we're in a school and we're not growing, learning, and developing, we're hurting people because the world is learning and changing. And so I think until we create a space where it's like you are consistently learning and developing and understanding yourself so that you can therefore serve others, I think that's the necessary step.
All right. Well, thank you both for this conversation, for coming on our show. Jeff, I believe we have one-on-one interviews with them as well.
That we do. Yeah.
Where are folks going to find that?
On our website, which is aotashow.com. Again, that's aotashow.com, where you can find all of our content. Everything we ever make is available there. And you can watch, listen, subscribe, and support the show. Share it with those who might also be interested in a conversation like this as well. But definitely want to thank Erin and thank Emily for joining us here today on All the Above. I think our streak, Manuel, of having only the dopest of dope educators on the show is fully intact after this conversation. So thank you for
Adding
that.
1,000, definitely.
Yeah. But really appreciated having you here, and just so much to think about. Signs for hope and a call to action, perhaps, around meeting the needs of our LGBTQ youth. So thanks for joining us, folks. And next up is our class dismissed. All right, folks, it is time now for our class dismissed, where we like to give a little shout out to some folks in our field who are doing noteworthy and amazing things all across the country, or really even across the world.
Indeed.
Manuel, who we got today?
So today we have an educator who actually hails from the great state of Minnesota. One of two dope educators I know from Minnesota.
I'm sorry, what state was that?
Minnesota.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you mean the great state of Minnesota. Yeah. Okay. Just making clear.
Yeah. Actually, Minnesota has a lot of dope educators.
They do, don't they?
Yeah, quite a few.
Or should I
And
say,
you.
we do, don't we?
All right, so this is the 2018, or today's class dismissed. This shout out goes to the 2018 Minnesota Teacher of the Year, Kelly D. Holstein, who during the National Football Championship game, which was attended by your president, Donald Trump.
Not my president. Not
Your
my
president, Donald
president.
Trump. Holstein,
Number 45.
Holstein was among a number of acclaimed teachers being honored at the national championship game between Louisiana State University and Clemson University in New Orleans, and during the national anthem, she took a knee. The educator later took to Twitter to speak on it, saying that she chose to kneel because she had, quote, a platform to stand up for marginalized and oppressed people. She wrote, like many before, I respectfully kneeled during the national anthem because no one is free until we are all free. She also added the hashtag I'm with Cap, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag LGBTQ. President Trump, I don't believe, said anything about this, although he was in attendance. Jeff, what do you think about this?
I love it. I want to give some serious props to Miss Holstein,
I believe.
however it's pronounced. I hope I'm saying it correctly. I want to give serious props to her because, look, I think this was an opportunity to use a national platform to make a very clear, very understood political statement. There's some risk involved, right, for her, and and I appreciate the solidarity. It it kind of reminded me of the same way that Megan Rapinoe, took it upon herself in a different, kind of a different venue as a different type of professional to use the platform she's given to make this statement, right? And so I like deeply appreciate it on a personal level. I think it's an effective way. Use the tools you have to deliver a message. And so I respect it. And I love that she's from Minnesota because, I'm from Minnesota. And so I think it's dope. I want to congratulate her and appreciate her for doing this. I really think it's great.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree. And State Teachers of the Year are invited each year to the White House to meet the president. And she's one of only two this year who boycotted that trip to the White House, basically citing the an immense amount of trauma that this president has inflicted on her marginalized students and student population. I do wonder if she realized or if she knew that the president would be attending this game, because I watch a lot of college football, and it was unannounced and it was a surprise. So when I was watching the game and the president came out with the first lady, I was surprised by that because I didn't realize he'd be at the game. And of course, going back to the World Series where he attended a game, a Nationals game, and he was booed widely and roundly and soundly by that stadium. Since then, he's attended two football sporting events, both in very red states, both in the Deep South, and he got a lot of cheers, but he also had this knee.
Yeah, I mean, so whether she knew, if she did know,
right,
if she did it because she knew,
dope.
then I'm like, word, props,
Yeah,
much
exactly.
respect,
Exactly.
Take it to the man, right? And if she didn't know, still props and respect because she's in, Louisiana. I think the game was in New Orleans, right? Mm-hmm. So she's in Louisiana, and making a very clear statement. Here's a teacher who serves students who are being directly negatively impacted by the policies put in place by this country. So whether she knew Trump was going to be there or not, the statement was important and appreciated, and I love it.
Dope. All right, so shout out to Kelly D. hosting. Hopefully we're saying your name right. Keep up the great work. Folks, on our website, we're going to link you to a TED Talk that she gave, and of course her tweets and statements around this. But also on our website, you'll find links to all of the stories that we reported on earlier this episode, but also links to our YouTube channel where you can see one-on-one interviews with today's very dope guests. And that's a YouTube video extra exclusive. So, definitely check those out. It's youtube.com/all of the above, all one word, or just go to the website, aotashow.com, and you'll see the page for this episode with all the links and all the extras right there for you. And that about does it for this week, Jeff.
Indeed.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us, folks.
In the books.
Indeed. We'll see you next time.
All right, folks. Take it easy.